Maybe it is time to start. We are starting late, but I hope that some people will join us shortly. So I am François Bourguignon. I'm not Susana Ruiz, who was supposed to chair this session. Unfortunately, Susana is not well, and she could not make it to Clermont. And so at the last minute, I will be a substitute for Susana. Now, one of the implications of her not being well is that this session has not been very well prepared. There was no consultation among us. So maybe we will say exactly the same thing 5 or 6 times. Maybe we will say things completely different. Hopefully it will be dealing with taxes. But okay, I hope you'll excuse this state of affairs. So let me first of all present the panelists. We have a very, very impressive set of panelists. I don't know in which order I have to go because the order in the program is not the order on my my list, and it is not the order we have there. So, okay, let me start maybe following the program. So first we have Nora Lustig. Nora is a Samuel Stone Professor of Latin American Economics in Tulane University. And she is director of the Commitment to Equity Institute in that same university. And you'll see in just a moment the kind of work done by this institute. And she is, last but not least, a GDN board member. Then on the program, we have Anda David. Anda is a scientific coordinator and senior researcher at the Agence Française de Développement, AFD, which, as you know, is funding partly this conference. And for many years, she has been working on inequality issues, and we are very happy to have her with us today. Then François Bourguignon on the list. I am an emeritus professor at the Paris School of Economics. I happen to be the chair of the GDN board. And in the old days, I've been a chief economist at the World Bank. Then we have Jennifer Chado-Joel. And Jennifer is a program fellow. Sorry, I have to get my paper. Program fellow, program officer on gender equity and governance program in the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. And Jennifer will be online. You can see her on the screen. Then following the program, we have Ahtesham R, who is the head of the, if I can read that, the head of tax for Sustainable Development Goals in the Sustainable Finance Hub in the United Nations Development Program at UNDP in New York. And finally, we have on my left side, Mario Mansour, who is a division chief of the Tax Policy Division in the Fiscal Affairs Department at the IMF. So, as you can see, it is really a brilliant panel, and we'll start immediately with presentations by each panelist for 10 minutes, and then we'll get to questions. Maybe I will take the floor as the last speaker. So let's start with Nora. Nora, it's very nice to see you on the screen. Hello, and you have the floor.
Thanks, François. A pleasure to be here. Bonsoir. a pleasure to be with all these distinguished panelists, and I'm really sorry I'm not there in person. Hopefully, I'll make it next time around. I was going to suggest that you should be first, given that I saw what you were going to say in the notes that you shared with us, and it's a little broader than what I'm going to present, but so be it, since I think there's going to be interesting overlaps and not just repetitions that will probably whet people's appetites to have discussions on the subject at hand. So I was thinking what we're going to present today in this panel. I decided to focus on the results for Latin America. As I'm going to share a screen, by the way, because I rather use a PowerPoint if it's okay with you guys. And by the way, I want to thank GDN, Pierre, and all the organizers for including me in the panel. And also to apologize for not being there to say hello and bye to everybody that is part of the GDN family, with whom we work quite closely at the CEQ Institute as well. So I'm going to talk about fiscal redistribution in Latin America, but I think some of the issues that I'll be touching upon will be of broader interest. And if you allow me just a moment, François mentioned the CEQ Institute. We do a fiscal redistribution analysis using conventional fiscal incidence analysis. And this is the coverage of countries that we have. And we have a booth also, I believe, outside in the lobby somewhere, if people want to learn more about it. There's a computer there where you can explore on your own some of the things that I'm going to be presenting today. So the first thing that, François, you're going to touch upon, one thing that is very important in terms of analyzing tax systems. Well, the first thing that I always say is that analyzing the tax side without looking at the spending side is not appropriate if you want to assess the impact of the fiscal system on inequality and poverty. Inequality, not just in the income dimension, beyond the income dimension. It's very important to look also at what happens on the spending side. So all our work has emphasized the fact that you always want to try to cover as much as possible what the fiscal policy envelope is about in order to make an assessment of whether countries are doing the right effort to redistribute or not. But one of the things that I think, François, you're going to point out in your remarks as well is that size is very important. I mean, there are two elements that are crucial in determining whether a state is redistributive or not. One's the size and the other one, the progressivity, both on the tax side and the spending side. And regarding Latin America, one of the things that I always want to emphasize from the very start is that it is a very heterogeneous area. It's a region that shares in common many things, but not necessarily economic dimensions. And as you can see here, you have very small tax to GDP revenues on the left-hand side, with the Dominican Republic and the Guatemala being very small states, and you have huge states like Argentina and Brazil. By the way, this is data that spans the 2010s. We're not necessarily showing the last redistributive impact or the last government size, but I think it's illustrative of what's happening in terms of income redistribution by states across the world. And if you compare also the LAC average with the non-LAC developing areas in our sample, you can see they're very similar. Latin America is not very different from the rest, but very heterogeneous within. Same thing goes for spending. And as you can see, that there's a lot of heterogeneity within the region. There's similarities between LAC and non-LAC countries, as we can see here. And one thing that probably LAC has more is that it spends more on social spending. So the size of the states are very, very different. And so is the redistributive impact. What I'm going to show you now, or it's a graph with all the countries, and it gets a little messy, but I want to point out a couple of things that just shows what happens at the different levels of income concepts that we use in the commitment to equity analysis, where we start from pre-fiscal income, then we analyze what's the effect of direct transfers and direct taxes, and we get to disposable income, which is the income concept that you probably are more used to see in the databases that have information on inequality and poverty. Usually they stop here. However, a large part of the story in developing countries, including Latin America, happens here, because we'll see, especially on the poverty dimension, how important this is. Adding the subsidies and especially subtracting the indirect taxes from disposable income produces this concept that we call consumable income. And this one seems to be quite important to assess what happens to inequality and poverty, particularly to poverty, as we'll see later on in the various countries. And finally, we have final income, which includes the monetized value of public spending on education and health. So this is Latin America, and we have the average for Latin America, which is the red, and the average for the non-lag, which is the blue. And what, I mean, I'm not gonna have time to spend explaining this graph, but you have the pre-fiscal income, disposable income, consumable income, and final income. That's what we see here. And I think to note this, compare countries that start with similar levels of inequality, like Brazil and Honduras, and see how different they are in terms of the impact of redistribution once the fiscal system machinery is at play. Brazil redistributes much more than Honduras, even though they have the same pre-fiscal inequality. Likewise, if you compare Colombia and Paraguay, they end in the same, post-fiscal Gini using final income, but they start at very different levels when you look at what happens here. Their income inequality at the pre-fiscal level is quite different. So Colombia is making more of an effort than Paraguay when you compare those. So countries can act very differently in terms of the fiscal effort to redistribute, and it's important to point that out. Then, one of the things that we looked into, and we found some surprises here, is when you analyze each one of the interventions separately, what do we find in terms of their impact on inequality? Well, there are two that are pretty much what everybody expects. Direct taxes and direct transfers are always equalizing, so no surprises there. But where we found surprises are in the indirect taxes and indirect subsidies. Turns out that the indirect taxes and indirect subsidies are equalizing in more cases than they are unequalizing within Latin America. So it's not true necessarily that they're regressive from the inequality point of view, but stay tuned for what happens to poverty. We also found that primary and secondary education spending is equalizing across the board, and in many cases is pro-poor. Tertiary education, which a lot of people think it's unequalizing, it's equalizing as well in 8 of the 18 countries. And health spending is always equalizing. So there's some surprises here once you start focusing on specific questions. One thing that we also wanted to sort of check this, these are results on broad patterns. Is there a relationship between size and redistribution? Yes, the higher social spending, the higher the redistributive effect. And you can see that Latin America is both above and below the regression line. So the heterogeneity here is shown as well. And the other thing that we try to see is whether we find the Robin Hood paradox, which is Peter Lindert's finding. Historically, he found that countries that were more unequal tended to devote less resources to tax-based redistribution. Well, we don't find that in the current context. There tends to be the more pre-fiscal inequality, the greater the social spending to GDP, which we take as a tax-based redistribution effort. So that's relatively good news, if you want, compared to what used to happen in the past. Now, let me move to poverty because I know that we need to move fast. As I showed you, inequality always falls. Inequality, the more unequal, the more social spending, the more social spending, the greater the distributive effect. All those are good news. Now, let's look at poverty. Here, the good news stop. Because one of the things that we found over and over in our analysis is that particularly when you add the impact of indirect taxes, even though fiscal systems are always equalizing, they can be poverty increasing. So a second message that we repeat from the CEQ perspective is it's very important not to analyze the impact of fiscal systems on inequality. It's also crucial to analyze what happens on poverty. So here I show you, what happens with the $320 a day, which is still using the 2011 PPP. Now there's a new set of poverty lines that were launched recently. And the red bars are the cases in which poverty, the headcount ratio measured with this poverty line, which is the extreme poverty line for middle income countries, is higher after the fisc than before the fisc. So we see a bunch of countries in which poverty is higher, including Brazil. Remember, Brazil redistributed quite a bit. It looked pretty good on the inequality front. On the poverty front, it no longer looked so good. And it's primarily because of indirect taxes that you have this impact on poverty that is an undesirable effect of fiscal systems, because we want poverty to be lower also after the fisc, not higher, to the extent that's possible. Now, some people may argue, okay, but it's not just that this fisc spends on cash transfers, it also spends on in-kind transfers like education, health, housing, infrastructure. That's true. However, if we take seriously that poverty lines are a reflection of what may happen to people's living standards, and we want to make sure that the poor are less poor, spending on education and health and other in-kind benefits is not enough because they cannot be eaten. They're not, you cannot transfer them, you cannot translate them into purchasing power. So I think that it's very important that when you examine the effect of fiscal policy, you look at what happens to poverty as well. So in conclusion, we find that fiscal systems are always equalizing, but can often reduce the purchasing power of the poor. And I think this is, we always say this is a warning in terms of unintended consequences of the domestic resource mobilization emphasis, which may be making the poor worse off if we don't look at what happens on the spending side as well. Mauricio was mentioning in the previous panel that there's been a message to the doing business that they should not encourage reducing taxes as part of the rewards of the points that are given to countries. I also would like to add, maybe increasing taxes is not always good, if particularly the poor are the ones who share the greatest, share a burden of what this increase in taxes means. Finally, I also wanted to mention one thing that, I said that all the systems, the fiscal spending on education and health looks very promising from the inequality point of view, because they're all equalizing, except in some countries spending on tertiary education. And they're often pro-poor, meaning that per capita spending is higher the lower the income. But what we think this may be also a reflection of something that's not so great, which is the fact that middle classes and the rich opt out of the public services, and that has a negative effect on the quality of them, because then there is no buy-in in terms of ensuring that the quality of these services are the level that they should be in order to satisfy the needs of education and health at the desirable levels. So let me stop here and thank you. And I hope to be able to engage in discussion later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nora, for this review of facts. No doubt that some of the conclusions do apply to other countries not in Latin America. Now I will give the floor to Anda. It's your turn.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So what I wanted to talk very briefly is the role that DFIs could play in this link between tax reforms and inequality. And we all know today that inequality is a threat to development, and this is also reflected in the 2030 agenda. And DFIs are starting to increasingly integrate this in their objectives and in their strategies. The EU was quite the pioneer on this, and they're currently developing an inequality marker for their projects, and on which we've worked jointly. On the IFD side, we have two big commitments. One, which is that 100% of our operations are in line with the Paris Agreement. The other one is actually linked to inequality, to inclusion, and it's a 100% social link commitment, which in practice makes us think much more deeper into how are our operations or the policies that we are supporting having an impact on inequality and inclusion. What we see is that we are all faced with these challenges, which are on the one hand. I hope that wasn't me. I don't think so. No? They are being busy there. So. Okay. Should I continue? Yeah. Yeah. So the challenge. Okay. What we get when we talk about inequality.
Change on.
Hello.
Okay. Reassuring. I really don't think it's a scarf though. The technicians don't agree with this. Do I try? Okay, I can try this. Okay, so the issues that we have. Okay. On the one hand side, we did mention this quite a few times, that what we are seeing in low and middle income countries is that direct taxes are being paid by a very small amount, a small share of the population, while indirect taxes are more often than not regressive. And Nora showed that they're not always regressive, but we see additional challenges. For instance, with a research paper on sub-Saharan Africa, and what we see is, for instance, that tax compliance declines with the degree of spatial inequality. So this is not something that we had seen in other contexts. What we also have in low and middle income countries is this issue of transparency and access to data. In Mali, the digitalization of tax revenues had a huge impact in terms of increasing tax mobilization. But what you also see is that it's very difficult to actually get access to those data. And that's regarding the access of researchers, this is still, we're still very far from where we could be. The issue of perceptions, and this was also something that was mentioned this morning. We did a project in Mexico looking at the tolerance to inequality and the perceptions of taxation. And what we see is that, for instance, Mexicans overestimate the share of the rich people. They underestimate what they are paying in terms of taxes. And when asked about their desired level of inequality, that level does not match at all the level of taxation that they would like to pay. So we have these different issues that we need to factor in. Now, what we're trying to do is trying to understand how we can then support and leverage our support into increasing the inclusivity and the progressivity of tax reforms. Of course, in the operation side, we do have this, we have lots of support to partner governments in terms of increasing revenue mobilization, of supporting transparency. But what we are also seeing is that there is this need, and it was mentioned in the previous panel, of increased tools and increased ownership of the available tools. We did a partnership with the CQ Institute through GDN, trying to expand the fiscal incidence analysis that Nora was presenting to other countries. And one of the examples is Morocco, where the fiscal incidence analysis was quite old, and they were in need of trying to understand how progressive or regressive their fiscal policy was. And not only the analysis were quite beneficial, but the government, the Ministry of Finance, they continued using the tool in their fiscal reforms. Some similar happened also in South Africa. So this issue of ownership of the tools is quite important. And then the last one would be the support to research. What we are seeing again is that we need to support more data collection on this. But also to develop the country profiles. We are running inequality diagnostics, for instance, together with the statistical offices in some of the countries where we work. And we realize that very often these statistical offices do not know exactly what is available data or the results in terms of the progressivity of the fiscal policy. Another type of inequality that we are seeing is that in terms of production of knowledge, because a lot still of the analysis on inclusivity, on tax reforms is, I would say, concentrated in the North. So supporting also research in the global South on these issues is quite crucial. Now, just to end very briefly, what we are also seeing today is that the most important inequalities remain the inequalities between countries and not necessarily within countries. So the issue of the global taxation and the international cooperation should be something that's not swept under the carpet and needs to be brought into the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anda. And I mean, you could have continued for at least 2 minutes because of the credits that you got with the mic. Okay, now I'll give the floor to Jennifer. Jennifer, can you come in?
Yes, thank you very much. And just like Nora said, first I want to begin with an apologies for presenting remotely. And just like she said, I look forward to attending in person next year. I know with COVID, this is the first time for a lot of people to be going to a conference in person, and I'm sure we will soon get to our post-COVID, pre-COVID levels of conference attendance. So, so for today, I would like to share a bit about our work at Hewlett Foundation on women economic empowerment and its intersection with tax justice. So I will preface that with sharing the goal of our women economic empowerment strategy, which is one of 5 strategies under our Gender, Equity and Governance program. So at the Hewlett Foundation, our goal within the next 5 years is actually to promote the adoption, funding, and implementation of gender-responsive macro-level economic policies that support all women's opportunities, well-being, and agencies, particularly in East and West Africa. So within that, we have several focus areas, including tax justice, informal economy, early childcare development, and supporting feminist movements. And I've actually been very glad to hear Nora and Anda speaks to the fiscal incidence of taxation and its effect on inequality and inclusivity of tax reforms. So I would like to talk to or speak to a different dimension of this issue, which is the economic incidence. Like we all know, with physical incidence, particularly for women, we can talk about tax burden. And when we are speaking about the experiences of women in East and West Africa, we need to consider the informal economy and the reality that majority of women in countries, in East and West Africa countries, actually work in the informal economy. And so it's a larger percentage of that. So one of the assumptions is that these women are outside of the formal tax systems. But current scholarship actually shows that there are different local governments or municipal governments often implement, design and implement several mechanisms for tax collection, even for the informal economy. Particularly, I can give an example of the city of Lagos, where you see a lot of women and men selling on the road or having kiosks by the roadside. And there are officials of the municipal council that come and pay tax and to collect taxes from them. And with that, there's also the issue of multiple taxation by different government agencies. So I'm sharing that to say that even in terms of fiscal incidence of tax and the burden that that ensues from that, women are also disproportionately vulnerable, even when they work within the informal economy and they might be outside of the normal framework of tax administration. And with all of that conversation is also the need for increased revenue, internal generated revenue for local government and all of those issues. But to move away from that, particularly for women economic empowerment, we need to consider the effect of the economic incidence of taxation, particularly for women. So even when they don't bear the primary fiscal responsibility for taxation, they are burdened with the indirect effect of it. So whether in terms of the increase in unpaid child care or unpaid household care that they have to undertake. And also, or we speak to it in terms of their lack of access to tax subsidy, either for women products or even for taking care of their children. There are several dimensions of by which women experience the economic burden of taxation. And within that, at the Hewlett Foundation, we realized that this is an issue that is not yet taking center stage in terms of conversation, whether we're speaking to scholarship or policies. And like a lot of scholars in the field have shared, the policy environment is mostly male dominant. And there is very little consideration of gender in the design of macro level economic policies, including taxation. So our goal within the next 5 years is to actually promote and support scholarship and advocacy that promote such consideration, particularly gender, in the design and implementation of tax justice reforms. An example of that is current ongoing work in terms of social protection and cash transfers. And we are seeing an increased number of countries actually implementing social protection program as a way of lessening tax burden on women, because often women are the direct beneficiaries of social protection programs. But we are also seeing women benefiting from such social protection by being able to access loans and other form of financial support. So within this framework of the economic and fiscal incidents of taxation, particularly in East and West Africa, the question for us at the Hewlett Foundation and what we are also posing to the field is an inquiry about how do we promote gender responsive macroeconomic policies? How do we encourage policymakers to center gender as a key consideration in the design of tax reforms? And for researchers particularly, how do we include economic incidence of taxation as a key consideration, whether in terms of data collection or in the way advocacy is framed, advocacy programs are framed. I would admit that I did not come here with a lot of answers. I have more questions and a desire to learn. But through the course of this conference, I'm hoping to hear a lot of insight and to learn from what is going on in the field. And in that way, really hoping that these become an opportunity to encourage scholarship, advocacy, and development programming on tax justice and women economic empowerment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And now I give the floor to Ahtesham R.
Thank you, François, and thank you to GDN for inviting me today. Good afternoon, everyone. It's difficult to speak on tax policy and inequality after Nora has already spoken. You know, she so eloquently covers every aspect of it and goes so deep in her understanding that there is always something to learn for us. So what I will do is I will take this opportunity to reflect more on the monetary policy side and its impact on tax systems, how tax systems need to respond to it, the work that is happening and the ongoing discussions at the United Nations, and finally, the work that UNDP is doing on the ground on different aspects of inclusion, inequality, gender, and tax systems. And I will also look at tax systems more broadly, try to cover different aspects of tax administrations also and how inclusive they are. And I will try to complete all of it in 10 minutes, François. We all know that the world is facing the 3C crisis in terms of the conflict, the COVID, and the climate. During COVID, a lot of governments pumped a lot of money into the economy, and the interest rates were to the lowest in many countries. US had an interest rate of around 0.25, leading to a lot of surplus money in the market. Due to the conflict in Ukraine and due to the war in Ukraine, and there has been rise in prices of oil. The oil is now trading around 110. There is an inflation, runaway inflation in many countries. Inflation in many countries is around 6–7%. US has an inflation of around 7%, meaning that now in US, at least, the governments are raising the interest rates. So much so that from 2.25% interest rate in March, now the interest rate stands at 3.75 in US, and there is indications that it will go till 5% for next March before tapering off. What it means is that the US markets suddenly become very lucrative for investors. And there are capital flows happening from across the world to the US. Now, what that means is that the dollar is increasingly getting more strengthened, and other economies and other exchange rates are getting weaker. Now, many developing countries are dependent on imports of oil and fuel and food. What it means is they will have to pay much more for importing these goods. And the biggest sufferer is going to be the common man on the ground, because their purchasing power is going to decline. So the challenge with inflation and the change in exchange rate is not for now. It's going to be there for the coming few years, actually. So that means this question on inequality is going to accentuate in the coming days, and the questions on poverty are going to become much more important. Now, there are ongoing discussions, and there are no easy answers for any government to choose between fiscal policy and monetary policy responses. And there is no one-size-fits solution for all. There are discussions happening across multilateral organizations on what is the best course of response, how we can stop from a looming depression that might be coming. At the United Nations, the Secretary General, as part of his common agenda, referenced the need for solidarity taxes, the need for windfall taxes. We saw during COVID how while the governments didn't have the money, a lot of billionaires made so much more money. A lot of, and we heard about it in the morning also, how many of the multinational enterprises have not paid so much taxes, but have made a lot of money. Secretary General, in his remarks a few months back, talked about the greatest greed of the oil companies, how they have earned so much, but have not been paying as much taxes. These questions are being discussed. We discussed in the morning also on the discussions happening at OECD on the global minimum tax and the need to go for some sort of a minimum tax, at least as part of the Pillar 2 discussions. They are progressing well in inclusive framework. Simultaneously, UN is also looking at, and the Secretary General in his report last month to the General Assembly, the 77th session of the UN General Assembly, talked about the need to move towards more inclusive and democratic governance structures and on illicit financial flows. Last May, during the meeting of the African finance ministers, they also called on the United Nations to pick up the issue of a UN tax convention. You may not all be very familiar with the working of the UNGA, but as of now, it's the 77th session of the General Assembly, which is in progress. The GA functions through 6 committees. The second committee deals with all the social and economic issues. Some of the member states, led by Nigeria, have presented a draft resolution for a UN tax convention for international tax cooperation. These discussions are ongoing in the General Assembly. Many a times, it's not an easy, one of the things that is in the draft resolution is to form an ad hoc committee which can form a TOR for a tax convention. So it's a long-term approach, but those discussions have already started. As part of the work that we are doing at the UNDP, we are very cognizant of the changing macroeconomic scenario and what it might mean for different governments across the world. At country level, and something that Jennifer also referenced, the question on inclusion is not just in terms of its impact. That is one way of addressing inclusion while looking at the impact. Many times it's more important to go back and look at the systems themselves, like the participation of female tax administrators is going to be really important in determining the impact that the tax policies are going to have on the women in the long run. In the short run, we can look at different tax policies, but in the long run, the approach has to be that how we can have more female tax experts in the tax administrations. Many tax administrations don't have a touchstone or a data on these questions, something that we discussed today in the morning also. UNDP has been working with a lot of different organizations on gender seals, which provides a sort of a guardrail to see, and it provides certification to see whether they are gender neutral in their processes or not. We are bringing these gender seals to the tax administrations also. Simultaneously, there has always been this discussion on tax and SDGs, but a lot of people don't exactly know the intersections beyond a few of the SDGs. Like everyone knows that there is a need to curb illicit financial flows, there is a need for greater DRM, there is a need for greater female participation. But when we look at it, every SDG has some sort of tax linkage. At UNDP, we have developed what we call as an SDG taxation framework. The taxation, the SDGs, which are the Sustainable Development Goals, provide what is to be reached. They don't go into how that can be reached. Now, different countries have leveraged the tax and fiscal policies in different manners to reach those SDGs or on their journey. Through the SDG taxation frameworks, the different countries have an opportunity to see what are the best practices across the globe on this. Simultaneously, we are also working with many developing countries in bridging the gap. A sort of question that has always come in is the gap between the understanding on tax and SDG issues and tax issues itself between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Finance, and the tax administration. And this goes to the questions on ownership also, because as Mauricio was talking before this panel, it's very difficult to get the ownerships when politicians are going for reforms. So we are working with many different governments to bring coherence and synergy in the understanding on tax and SDG issues at the country level, at the regional level, and at the global level. For now, I will stop here and I will pass you back.
This is fine. I mean, if you want to stop, it's okay.
I will come back.
Oh, okay, fine. Okay. Okay, thank you very much, Ahtesham. And now Mario, sorry. Mario, it's your turn.
Thank you. If there's a way to put up the 2 slides I sent, that would be nice. I think that would help the arguments a little bit. The 2 slides I sent to Ramona. But if not, it's okay. I'll start just. So 2 points I want to make. One is, what do we know about progressive taxation in developing countries? Some stylized facts. The other point is, what are some of the key challenges in making income taxes more progressive? Obviously, I fully agree with the idea that if you want to compare equalities of tax and spending, what Nora presented is the ideal. But tax design matters for a number of other reasons. For example, incentives for women in the labor market, with children, without children, etc., are completely wiped in those comparisons where we add simply what you pay in taxes and when you get what you get in transfers from government. So all these incentives are not, do not show in those indicators. We need to dig deep into how tax systems are really designed for these things. So personal income taxes in developing countries, in case you didn't know, are progressive on paper. And in some countries, they are actually very progressive, more so than in developed countries. And I'll use 2 regions with a bit of extremes to illustrate these points later. One is the MENA regions, Middle East and North Africa. The other is the Western Balkan regions, on which we happen to be doing some work currently. But this progressivity is in effect primarily on labor income. Capital income, mobile or otherwise, is very lightly taxed. And when it is, it's taxed at flat, relatively low rates. The revenue contributions of income taxes in developing countries, in part because of those highly progressive structures and virtually no taxation of capital income, is very low, in the order of 2% of GDP. Obviously, it varies across countries, but it's very low. And when we say it's very low, by definition, it cannot be very equalizing. If a tax doesn't raise a lot of money, it cannot instill a lot of progressivity in the tax and spending system. So that said, this is on the concern side. On the positive side, there has been some progress. I mean, if you look at trends in personal income taxes over the past 2-3 decades, there's a good story to be told. Perhaps around 0.5 to 1% of GDP increase in those taxes. However, we don't understand well what is the quality of the increase. What are the sources of the increase? So just to give you an example, we know that in countries with high natural resources, the public wage bill increased during periods of increase in prices in oil and gas or mining, if you're a mining country. And in those periods, while governments give a lot of raises to public service or hires more public service employees. And so the wage bill increases. Well, the wage bill is taxed. So the government is spending more from oil revenue and taxing more. What does that mean in terms of, our understanding of income taxation is not crystal clear to me, at least. And as I said, this issue of progressivity may not matter if you can address the lack of, with spending. But I still think that for incentives and particularly issues like inclusiveness, where in some countries, the young and those educated, they don't care much about equality of incomes. They care a lot more about equality of opportunity. And tax systems can be very, very detrimental to opportunity. For example, very high marginal tax rates at fairly low income could push actually people in the informal economy with all the consequences on, getting a loan to buy a house, getting more training or more education, etc. So the two regions I want to talk about, the Balkans and the MENA country, well, we have this, so I might as well show the. No, that's the wrong one. That's the one I presented this morning. But anyway, in the Balkans, what characterizes these countries is very low flat rate on income, mostly wage income, almost no taxes on capital income, and very, very high social security contributions. So basically what you have is fairly flat marginal or average tax rates curves at very low income levels, right, in theory. And those average tax rates, obviously, they drop very, very quickly when your income increases. Why? Well, because when you're high income, probably the source of your income is not labor, it's something else. It's business income, it's something else. And these tend to be treated by law differently. And so what you have is a bit of either a bell shape or actually some sort of a square marginal tax rate structure where you start high at very low incomes and then you drop at certain point to very low levels. The progressivity capacity, an indicator, think of it as just an indicator. I don't want to bore you with the measurement, but the progressivity capacity of these countries, when you add social contributions, they can be very high, but they don't redistribute much. Why? Because those rates are high at low incomes. There is quite a bit of informality because of those low incomes, and therefore the tax itself doesn't generate much revenues. In the MENA, the story is different. They have standard, very progressive, nicely progressive bylaw tax structures, often with 4 or 5 rates, an exemption threshold. And what you find there is most of the action in the average tax rate curve, meaning the progression, the marginal tax rate, the progression in the tax rate as you move along the income ladder, most of the action happens below GDP per capita, roughly, which is about $10,000 for this region. So the curve is going to go something like this, and then it'll flatten very rapidly. This is the theoretical curve. De facto, actually, what it does is probably something like this, and then drops, because then your income is coming from something else. When you add social contributions, the story becomes even more dramatic, because social contributions in most of these countries don't have a floor. So you pay them at the first dollar of income earned. And so it makes the curve even more dramatic at low income levels. So one example I like to give is that can we tell a good story of these curves changing over time? So you can actually make the income tax progressive at the right hand of the income distribution and raise more revenues. Because the argument that policymakers in these countries make is that we can't tax at high income. We need to tax by withholding, and the only thing we can withhold is payments to labor, salaries and wages, with which I totally disagree, because you can withhold on interest and dividends on a lot of things, but these are political economy issues. But let's put this aside. Can we look at an example where actually countries did something that would actually make the curve slightly smoother, still be more equitable in terms of progressivity, and raise more money? And one example in our work that we found is Morocco. over the past 20 years, actually, the curve is slightly flatter of average tax rates. And Morocco raises 1% more of GDP in personal income tax. So if you're taxing less labor, that means that this country has managed actually to tax capital income slightly on the right side of the income distribution. So there are good stories to be told. What we don't know is what is the role of the tax administration in this story. I mean, did they do it at a constant tax administration capacity, or did they build capacity actually to better handle things like, you know, switching from labor income to business income, which is a standard strategy, right? Most countries tax business income lightly than the top marginal rate of labor income. Corporate tax rates are almost always in all countries lower than the top marginal rate on personal income. So a strategy not to pay top rates is simply to incorporate or earn income that would be labeled for tax purposes as business income rather than labor income, right? So that's a very easy strategy used in many countries, and you can fix it with design, but for some reasons countries don't, probably politics. So what happens here, and I think this country has managed actually to better understand its tax base, not only, you know, for design purposes, for policy design, but also for risk management and compliance. So in conclusions, I think we don't really have a very good story to tell about the progression of personal income taxes in developing countries over the past 2 decades, if the objective is to make them more progressive, right? But there are differences across countries, a lot of differences. And I think the example of Morocco, and I'm sure there are other examples out there that we can find, simply tells us that it is possible. And actually the political economy in Morocco, you would think, is more complicated than in parliamentary system, in a democracy, but yet this country has managed to do something that's not dramatic, but goes in the right direction. Can countries really succeed? I would say yes. Do they have to follow, if they cannot succeed, the Latin American example and, you know, do more with spending? I'm not convinced that this is a trajectory for all countries to follow. I mean, you can certainly make the fiscal system more progressive with spending, but I do believe that for incentives, tax design matters, and you have to address both of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mario. Okay, let me take the floor for a few minutes. Very much has been said until now. And as Nora said at the beginning, the remarks that I prepared were more general remarks. But I believe that there are some of them are relevant even at the end of this session. Now, the point, the evidence that we are confronted with is the fact that in developing countries, in particular in low-income countries, the average tax rate is low, and the progressivity does exist, as Mario just said, but it is also limited, and limited very much because of the relatively low size of the personal income tax. Now, if we have in mind a very standard social welfare function, we can say, or we can propose that those the tax system in those countries is not satisfactory. We should raise more money through the tax system, and possibly would like it to be more progressive. Now, the question I want to ask is, fine, I mean, how could we get such a conclusion? I don't want to get back to the old optimal taxation theory, but the point I would like to make is maybe this tax system in those countries are optimal given the capacity that does exist in those countries. So one possibility would be to say, fine, if we say that optimal taxation is obtained when increasing taxation is producing a cost for the economy and a cost for the tax administration, which may be more than the benefit that the government will get, then okay, we have something which is optimal. But the important point here is the fact that it is optimal, not in absolute term. It is optimal in the sense that the tax capacity is limited. And we can have exactly the same kind of argument in terms of progressivity. But there is another possible view. The other view is that the welfare function or the objective function of the government or the tax authority may not be in agreement with what we generally have in mind, which would be to increase the welfare of all the people and possibly with some progressivity. And this leads us to something which I believe is quite important. And I was very surprised not to have heard this word since the morning, which is political economy. The tax system is determined by a political process. In this political process, we have a government. The government cannot do whatever it wants. Even in an authoritarian regime, the dictator knows very well that by doing this and by doing that, it will be affecting either a big mass of the population or maybe the economic elite over there. He cannot do that, or she cannot do that. And the point is that what we observe in those countries, a low level of tax, a low progressivity, may be essentially the result of a political economy equilibrium, which is making changes, reforms difficult. So we may have capacity on the one hand, but we also have the political equilibrium. And let me give you an example of this. Recently, I worked within a project on institutions in development on Bangladesh, and within that study, we had a very good chapter written by a Bangladeshi economist, Ahmed, and which was on taxation. And he was really explaining or analyzing the taxation system in Bangladesh in a very, very neat way. And one of the points that he was making was about VAT taxation. Bangladesh is a country where the average tax rate is one of the lowest in the world. It is below 10% of GDP. For many, many years, the government has said, we need to increase the average tax rate. All the plans in development plans in Bangladesh say we have to increase the average tax rate. Then one day they decide to start a tax reform on VAT, increasing the tax base and at the same time increasing the sum of the tax rate of VAT. And the tax authority prepared the reform. It was very well done, very skilled people working with IMF technical assistance. All this is very well prepared, and the reform is about to start when suddenly the government said, no, stop, we won't make it. And the reason for this was simply that the Federation of Chambers of Commerce said, no, we don't want this reform because many retailers who today are not paying any tax, then will be paying tax. Some of them will simply, and even those who are paying tax today, because the tax will be higher, will simply get into informality. So we don't want this tax reform, and the tax reform was stopped. This was in 2012. Since then, nothing has been done. And here you see exactly the point. I mean, this is clientelism. Those people were not, those retailers were not especially powerful, but they were voters. And because of that, the government or that government at that time didn't want to antagonize those people. Now, this is something extremely important to understand what is going on. And in the same project, I worked on different countries, and in every country, I think I'm able to tell a story which is very, very similar to this one. So I'm not saying that nothing is possible because of political economy reasons, because there are people who are against the tax reform. I'm not saying that. This is certainly not true. There is some room for maneuver. But in some cases, always we have to take into account the fact that the room for maneuver must take into account the kind of balance of power that does exist within the economy. And the point is not to sit back and to say, oh, too bad, those people are very powerful and they will block any reform of the personal income tax because they don't want to see their exemptions disappear. Fine, but I think there is much more to do. First, we can analyze the situation. Economists, NGOs, academics may get donors, may get into the system as it exists and show the way in which the system is actually distributing or redistributing income across people. This is not something which is completely obvious. We just heard Mario telling us about progressivity. Progressivity is not something which is easy to measure. And what I'm saying here about the actual systems is that we would like to have the whole progressivity of the whole system, and to show that, to make this information public, then we have a chance that when the balance of power will be modified in the country, maybe somebody will be seizing this opportunity to make a tax reform. We must also work on capacity, in the sense that even if political economy reasons are important in blocking some reforms, the point is that there is an area, as I said before, where there is room for maneuver, and there the system can be improved. And it is quite important that the system be improved where it is possible. And from that point of view, capacity is essential. And even if the room for maneuver is at one point of time very limited, then by improving the capacity of the system, then it will be possible the day there is a change in the balance of power to take those opportunities to truly make a reform. But if the capacity is what it is today in some countries, then, sorry about this, yeah, maybe they say that this is, I passed my time. Okay, maybe I lost track of what I wanted to say. No, the point is simply that we must, even if there is no room for maneuver, the fact that there is a better capacity at one point of time will allow the reformist, when the opportunity shows up, to indeed undertake a reform. So these are very general views about taxation, about progressivity, but I had the feeling that it was quite important to to put on the table that political economy is a key factor in understanding what is going on with the tax systems. I'll stop here okay, just in my time, that's fine, incredible. Okay, I should now try to summarize what we heard, but from my colleague panelists. I think that there are a few things which come out. First thing is, of course, and this is the theme of this session, is progressivity. And I think it is quite interesting to listen to Mario saying that there is more progressivity than many people could think about, at least when you look at labor income. But we know also that the richest people are getting a little more than labor income. And what is interesting is that the situation is not very different in developed countries. This is exactly what we observe in the US, in many European countries. So this fact about progressivity is important. And we heard from Nora the fact that when we want to look at progressivity, when we look at redistribution, it's very difficult to isolate taxation from spending. And Nora has a very, very strong point, which is not in disagreement with the point by Mario. Mario said it is progressive, but Nora said it is progressive, but at the same time, it is reducing the income of everybody in the population, if we look only at taxation, and in particular, the income of the poor. And this is something that we need to take into account. So I think this is an axis, I mean, progressivity and the spending along which the other interventions, the presentations can be organized. When Jennifer talked about, Ahtesham talked about the SDGs and the taxation. Basically, this is another way of looking at progressivity. When we look at the SDGs, it is a different type of progressivity. It is not income progressivity, maybe progressivity in some other dimensions of the welfare of people. And this is something which we should keep in mind, because this is also a task of the taxation system to modify this. In the Anda's presentation, we were to some extent at the beginning, when she talked about perception, a bit close to my political economy kind of argument, saying that in any country, we know that any tax reform must be passed in front of a parliament, in front of the public opinion. And when she referred to the misperception that the public opinion may have of what the tax system is doing, we may understand why there may be some opposition to some tax reform. And this is very, very similar to the point I was making about the fact that political economy aspects are important, and public opinion is a part of that. And finally, a point made by Jennifer, I think, is really interesting, because this is to emphasize the issue of gender with taxation. Means that to some extent we need to go beyond the basic model that we have, where we essentially look at the household. I mean, the unit for personal income tax in most countries is a household. And when we look at progressivity, when we analyze redistribution, as Nora is doing in CEQ, we are looking at households. But if we want to look at the gender issue, we have to get within the household. We have to get into behavior. We have to get into the way in which the tax system may be modifying the behavior of people, and maybe modifying what is going on within the household. And it is a little what Mario said, when we should remember that taxation is also about incentives. And so this would be the way in which I would tend to link the various presentations made by the various panelists. And at this stage, I think that it is time to give the floor to give you the floor. So who would like to, in the audience, to make comments or questions? Yes, please. Oh, fine. Okay. So go ahead. You have the mic.
Okay, thank you. I'm Asbat Alassani from Togo, and I'm PhD student in development economic. So we already know that like death, tax are certain. From my point of view, the essential point is how tax are collected from home and how tax or how tax revenue is spent. So if tax structure play a role in reducing inequality, focusing on sub-Saharan Africa, the effectiveness of tax in promoting equity could be limited by several factors, like the tax structure of tax rates, the narrowness of the tax base, and the high level of informality and tax evasion. So also corporate income tax is eroded by many exemptions and favor granted to company. So my question is, do you think that personal income tax is appropriate in the context of inclusive development, given that high marginal tax rate distorts incentive to produce or work and encourage tax avoidance and evasion?
Okay.
My second question is, do you think that the effectiveness of the tax instruments depend on specificity, like the region or the income level of country?
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you very much. There was a question there. Okay, you'll be.
Yes,
No,
thank you.
go ahead. Go ahead.
Christian von Heidenberg from the German Institute of Development and Sustainability, IDOS. Two questions to Mario. First, you mentioned that you could imagine withholding on taxes on capital income, and you talked about dividends and others. And this is highly interesting. And I wonder, are you aware of countries that are governments that are successful in withholding taxes on this type of capital income? And could this be a policy of the fund, of the International Monetary Fund in the future, recommending to governments that they should follow this road? And the second question is about taxing capital income again. We have indicative research that exchange of information between tax authorities leads or opens the possibility for governments to be more effective in taxing portfolio investment and other types of capital income. And my question is, do you see that we are witnessing a game changer here with regard to the exchange of information between governments? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, please.
Thank you. Hello, Ahtesham R, researcher at Ferdi. My question is to Mario. In his progressivity analysis, I'm wondering if, because François mentioned that the political economy factors that are somehow linked to the behavior of people, of individual responding to the tax system. So in your analysis, did you find any evidence of behavioral response from individuals? Because I know Emmanuel Saez has pointed out, and later many other papers have pointed out the behavioral responses of people, the bunching response of people. And if you have seen any behavioral response, and if not, how do you explain the lack of responses? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. There was a question over there. Yes.
Merci beaucoup. C'est Saboumukiza Mertus. Je viens du Burundi, mais je fais mes recherches de doctorat à l'Université de Rennes 1 sur l'encadrement des incitations fiscales à l'investissement dans la communauté d'Afrique de l'Est. Et j'ai deux questions. La première question est adressée à Madame Jennifer. Et elle a parlé du secteur informel. C'est un secteur qui échappe parfois à la maîtrise du législateur qui a amené à mettre en place des dispositions en rapport avec ces taxes, qui échappent aussi aux collecteurs des impôts. Est-ce que vous, dans les études que vous avez faites, dans les enquêtes, études que vous avez faites, vous n'avez pas constaté que parfois les personnes qui interviennent dans le secteur informel sont soumises à une taxation arbitraire? Ça, c'est... La deuxième question est adressée à Monsieur Mario. Et il a donné l'exemple du Maroc, si j'ai bien saisi. La taxation des entreprises est moins élevée et et on sait que si les États diminuent le taux d'imposition des sociétés, des facteurs mobiles, ils ont tendance à déplacer cette charge fiscale aux facteurs moins mobiles, donc immobiles. Est-ce que vous n'avez pas constaté aussi ce problème au niveau du Maroc? Merci.
Est-ce que vous pourriez répéter votre première question en quelques mots pour que je puisse la traduire?
C'était pour savoir si les personnes qui interviennent dans le secteur informel ne sont pas soumises à une imposition arbitraire.
OK. Jennifer, this question was for you. And the question was whether people operating in the informal sector would not be, as a matter of fact, subject to taxation, which would be implicit and arbitrary. So, is there any other question? I will take the last one. Yes.
Two quick questions coming from online, and they're both positive news because people joining online, you provided a spark for them, and they'd like to know more. So, in particular, one question directly to Jennifer, wondering whether she's is aware of data on fiscal pressure disaggregated by gender. So I think that's something that François mentioned at the end, that the vast majority of the data that we do have is sort of at the household level. But Ewood is wondering whether Jennifer in particular knows if there is good data available to show the differences on men versus women, especially in developing countries. And then there's another question directly to Mario, wondering if he can point us to the Morocco case study and the other case studies that you described, which show a drop off in the effective average tax rates at very high incomes. So wondering if those studies are public, and if so, where they are.
Okay, so we'll stop here, and I will give the floor to maybe to Jennifer, who was asked directly 2 questions, then to Mario, and then I'll ask Nora and Ahtesham to say a few words to conclude. Jennifer, can you take up those 2 questions?
Yes, thank you. I'll try to respond as quickly as possible. So to the first question on whether individuals in the informal sector or women in the informal sector pay taxes, I would say yes. And scholarship and evidence exists, particularly for developed countries or developing countries in East and West Africa. And the tax administration structure at the informal level in East and West Africa, which is the context I'm most familiar with, is very different from what you have in Western Europe or in the US, majorly because they are informal institutional tax structures that work hand in hand with formal tax systems or formal tax administrators to collect such taxes. A quick example, like I mentioned, what is in the city of Lagos. So if you ask anyone that has ever visited the city, you will notice that even when people sell on the streets, they are actually individuals that are hired by the municipal government to collect taxes from street hawkers. So, and that is very different from what we have in developed countries. Then secondly, the question on whether there's enough data on fiscal pressure disaggregated by gender, the answer is simple, no. It is more easier to find data on physical incidents by gender in Western society, Western Europe, the US, but less so in developing countries. And this is also one of the reasons why at the Hewlett Foundation, we are really eager to support scholarship and research by scholars in East and West Africa, or that are working on these issues in such region to produce this kind of data. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mario, do you want to address the various questions that you were asked?
Okay, thank you very much. For the studies, if Ramona can make the PowerPoint, the few slides I prepared available, I have the list of references at the end. And so you can, pick up those studies. The 2 I used here are forthcoming, I hope next month or the month after. The others are available online on the IMF website. A few things I just briefly, because this is interesting discussion, not for today, but I just wanted to make sure that people understand that informality is not exogenous. It's, when we talk about pre-tax incomes in year T, pre-tax income is affected by taxes. what people declare depends on tax rules. So even those calculations that Nora presented, when we talk about the distribution of income of households, they are actually affected by taxes. So, saying that we can tax informality simply by having better tax administrations is not good enough. Design also matters because it creates those incentives for informality. On the other questions, I'll try to go quickly. Does the IMF recommend withholding taxes on dividends and interest? Absolutely. Actually, we do a lot of this work around the world. I think the differences across countries is one of political economy equilibrium, how much you can push the agenda for capital income taxation, because you want to recommend something that countries will end up doing. But saying, have a typical progressive personal income tax across the board, it simply doesn't work, particularly because of this equilibrium in the political economy in the country. But what we do recommend, the sensible thing is withholding on interest and dividends is fairly easy to do. It's not complicated. And if it's really, really complicated, you can tax net interest of banks, and some countries do it. Net interest of banks, if you exclude loans to business activities, is basically personal interest income, right? And talking about this, I do agree that, at least I hope, but we do see developments in high-income countries of how information sharing is reshaping compliance, not only on income, but also on wealth. For example, in my country, in Canada, we've been declaring our assets since the late 90s after a big tax court case where a very rich guy in Canada moved to the US and paid zero tax on his estate. It was a big, rich family. And that really pushed the country into, well, we didn't know about this, how much income was declared, etc. And now we have, like in many countries, regular wealth reporting for individuals. You have to report every year your not only income, but your assets worldwide. Now, in developing countries, I think it goes back to the political economy issue is the technology is available. Many countries in the Global Forum have accepted to exchange information. Will you do it? And this is a question. How can we motivate politicians to do it? Because it's going to fall on them. Primarily, it's going to fall on many, many of them, perhaps first and foremost. Behavioral responses to taxation, very much so. We actually, in this study I spoke about for the MENA region, it's not really behavior, but one thing that came out, which is not really surprising, is that the changes in personal income tax revenues over time is independent of tax policy itself. So if you take the parameters, the key parameters of the tax system, the top rate, the exempt threshold, how important is the exempt threshold in average income, all this doesn't seem to matter. What matters most, and I think there was one question asked about this, is income levels. Income levels and to a lesser extent, public sector wages are big drivers of personal income tax performance. We did do this morning, which we couldn't present in the data session on behavioral responses of a recent reform in a country where the tax rate was made progressive 1 year, and then for political reasons, it was ended the year after. So we had data actually to think about what happened during this year. And what happened is that you observe actually a massive underreporting of income that is a function of the level of incomes. One effect. The second effect was a displacement of income from labor because the tax rate was increased only on labor to business. So suddenly, instead of having, employees in a plumbing company, well, you have service contracts for a big plumbing company. So, and this shows very clearly in the data. It was an interesting exercise to do. And lastly, on the CIT rate, what happens if you lower the CIT rate? There is evidence in Europe, and I can say from my own experience, one of the reasons why the CIT is more important in developing countries is precisely this, is because I think more people in developing countries characterize their income as corporate income instead of labor income through incorporation, particularly on the high income side, which is why really when we analyze personal income taxes is a bit, accounting wise is a challenge because you don't know what it means. Is it really labor? Is it capital? It's very far from what we mean by the incidence of taxes. Who pays that tax? How can we actually look at it? But yes, if you reduce income, the CIT rates, study shows, including in Europe, that the incorporation becomes more important.
Okay, thank you very much, Mario. So let's make a last round of comments. Nora, do you want to say a few words to conclude about what was said during this session?
Yes, thank you, François. It's interesting, many themes to be pursued further. I think that, first of all, I want to repeat two things that I said in my intervention, is that the discussion about what to do with taxes probably should not be done independently of what can one do with those revenues on the spending side. The questions about whether to emphasize progressivity versus size, it's very important as long as we know what we're going to do with the revenues. Maybe as I don't know if the IMF spiel it still is the same now, but there used to be an emphasis on maybe it's important to collect taxes broadly and then do the redistribution on the spending side. And that is probably one of the key questions that we need to look into, because if increasing progressivity means shrinking the revenue pie, as you said, François, then we limit our ability to do things on the spending side, right? That's the first thing. So, but I think we need to have the systematic analysis of what is really the empirical evidence on this front. The second thing is I want to emphasize again that, and that's why it's important to look at the spending side as well, is that let's not just look at inequality, let's also look at poverty. Finally, that's our main concern. What happens to people at the bottom cannot be excluded from our fiscal policy priorities. The third comment I wanted to make is about gender sensitive or, intra-household analysis, because it's not only gender. We may be interested also what happens to children in terms of benefits, what happens to the elderly. I mean, there's agency issues within the household that are not captured when you do the typical analysis. And I think we're trying to sort of move forward in this respect within the CQ with some analysis. You can look at the working paper by Olivier Baguin in our website that begins to explore this intra-household dynamics. The World Bank is also doing this work with Jon, who was in the audience right now, was also mentioning is also involved in trying to develop a framework within the World Bank to do this intra-household analysis, particularly from the gender perspective. But what I can tell you is that somebody in the audience, or I think it was in the chat, asked if there are disaggregated results. Yes, you can look at the paper by Olivier Baguin. I think, Jon, then you can provide the sources for the work that the World Bank has been doing. And also, if you take a look at our website, there is a section on disaggregated by categories, and we have gender sensitive analysis for a bunch of the categories for which is easily implemented, that you can look, but particularly I think we have it for 5 Latin American countries already disaggregated. So there is disaggregated analysis by gender that you may find useful, whoever, several people asked about this. The final thing I wanted to say is it's important to mention that the studies that I shared with you have been produced by an enormous amount of people. And all the names I could not, I mean, if I spend the time in thanking everybody that has contributed to the production of the CEQ type of analysis, we will never end, but all the references are on our website. And I always want to emphasize that it's just a collective effort, what we're doing in the CEQ Institute. And thank everybody who has been part of our teams. including some of the members of the panel who has been supporting or collaborating with us, like and people at the IMF, and now with Ahtesham we're starting, and François has also been part of our collective effort. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nora. Now I give the floor to Anda. Yes, Anda.
Just again, like Nora said, one thing I would like to emphasize, because it was one of the first questions, is that we do not tax people to reduce inequality. We tax people in order to have the resources to ensure a minimum level of welfare for everyone. So tax policy is not inequality reducing policy per se. What actually matters is what's being done, and it can't be a policy to reduce inequality on its own. South Africa is the country that most redistributes across Africa, and it's still the most unequal country in the world. So we have to go back to this limited impact. But one thing that could be questioned is the relevance of some systems of personal income tax, for instance, but also of concepts such as wealth. When we see wealth in the academic literature, and when we see the reality on the ground, we do see that we need to rethink of how could we tax wealth, for instance, in low and middle income countries. And the last thing, I think in France, Hélène Périvier, if I'm not mistaken, from Sciences Po, has done some work on the impact of the fiscal system on gender inequality. So for those that were interested on this topic, for France, there are some quite interesting results and data. I will stop there.
Go ahead.
Very quickly, I think this was a question that was asked on investments and incentives. And this relates to what Mario was talking about in context of Canada also. In many of the studies, it has been found out that, the incentives that are being given may not actually yield investments benefits that are that are supposed to get. And the challenge is many countries don't even have the figures on tax foregone. And just by even looking, like in many countries, it has been seen, once we start making those a political push to make those figures public, governments start to consider the tax incentives much more seriously. And as we were talking about the lack of fiscal space governments have, there's a need for rationalization of tax expenditures also. And that's something also we are working on. Very quickly, this was a question that came up in the morning also, that we have to help countries, build up their capacities. What can be a catalytic means of, funding to do this? UNDP has been working together with OECD on Tax Inspectors Without Borders. It's an initiative to help tax administrators when they are conducting tax audits. As of now, we are working in more than 56 countries with more than 105 ongoing and completed programs. The work of Tax Inspectors Without Borders has helped developing countries collect more than $1.7 billion in additional taxation revenues. For every dollar that is being invested by donors, developing countries are reaping more than $127 in return. And I want to talk about it in context of the behavioral changes. One is for the taxpayers, the change in the behavior, but also the behavioral changes of tax administrators, because at the end of the day, they are the ones who are going to implement the tax laws. And in our work, we have seen, as we are implementing these programs, that their own sort of capacity building leads to behavioral changes in terms of their confidence. So I'll stop there and pass it back to François.
Thank you very much. Okay, I think that it is time to conclude this session. Maybe a few words to conclude. I think that it was quite clear in the discussion that we had that the taxation system in connection with inclusion and inequality really has two functions. One is to generate income, revenue that can be spent later on progressive projects, And this is not only redistribution through cash transfers to the poor people. This is also through growth in the economy over time. So, and to some extent, I would say that what is really important is more the dynamic part than the immediate pure redistribution. But at the same time, we cannot say, as it was said earlier, that the taxation system has nothing per se, independently from the spending, has nothing to do with progressivity. It has a huge role, of course, because this is a taxation system which is modifying the distribution at the top. And maybe you may have a completely neutral taxation system with a VAT, if the VAT is paid by everybody, if the rates are more or less identical across goods. But if you want to redistribute somewhat from the top, then the taxation must be progressive in the sense that Mario has mentioned. Rich people must pay a higher average tax rate than poor people. And I believe this is really one very, very important point that we should get from this discussion. Now, I simply have to thank the panelists for what I believe has been a very nice and exciting session. It has been a long session. Thank you very much for your patience, and have a good evening.